Fallujah, Iraq, 2004. Operation Vigilant Resolve is in full swing. Already, hundreds of Iraqi insurgents are thought to be dead, but coalition forces are taking heavy casualties. By the time the smoke clears, 51 coalition fighters will be dead, and hundreds more will be wounded. This was the topic of the readings in Billy's Gov class the day the occupation began.
I've heard rumors of an occupation by the COVID task force for a while now, but none of us really believed it was going to be true.
Until August 2020, the student body had continuously ruled Hamilton since 1812.
Looking back, we should have seen it coming. Back in March, they sent us home, and they were talking about weapons of mass infection. We kept telling them that we ended that program right after the norovirus outbreak of 2017, but they just wouldn't listen to us. Then, that's when the Campo car started rolling in.
On August 21st, 2020, the COVID Task Force, or CTF, invaded Hamilton and overthrew the student body. By August 24th, campus safety had begun occupying the campus as part of a peacekeeping mission. Officer Charles E. Cheese is a 4-year veteran of campus safety. He is currently serving his 3rd tour of duty.
The invasion was, well, to put it bluntly, it was easy. We took over campus during students' extended 2-week spring break. We thought that the early preparations were enough. Then the higher-ups told us we had to stay longer to protect the student body from themselves and from COVID. We had to start enforcing the new rules of the campus.
Andromeda Bowden experienced the occupation as a 3rd-year student at Hamilton College.
At first, almost everyone was excited to see campus safety protecting the students from the disease. We were excited for in-person classes, just to see our friends again. No one really talked about the insurgents because there were so few of them, and we all kind of thought they were crazy. But then it started. Our first weekend back, we were so excited to see everyone again. It had been so long, the extended break, we just hadn't seen any of our friends. So we were doing everything right. We were distancing, only taking our masks off when we were eating or drinking. We weren't doing anything wrong. But then they surrounded us. They came from the staircase, they came from the inside, all around. There were 5 or 6 of them, which seemed crazy for the amount of us that were out there. And then they asked for our identification, they wrote us up for violations we weren't even committing. What the hell did any of this have to do with COVID? They were on some sick little power trip. That's when I started listening to the insurgents. Maybe they weren't so crazy after all.
Zongo, not his real name, is one of the insurgent leaders at Hamilton. He agreed to an interview on the condition of anonymity.
Campo doesn't belong here. We didn't want them here. The student body ruled this campus for 200 years, and now the CTF thinks they can walk all over us. They have their soldiers ride around in their new Ford Explorers, and they break up parties that aren't even against their rules. This is not COVID prevention. This is tyranny. This occupation is about control.
As the semester progressed, tensions worsened, and the insurgent force grew to outnumber the occupying force. Collisions became frequent, and anti-campus safety demonstrations broke out throughout the campus. Tensions reached a boiling point on October 10th when demonstrators began throwing projectiles at the campus safety officers. Among the projectiles thrown were beer bottles and beer cans, such as the one shown in this campus safety photograph.
It wasn't enough. October 10th should have been the beginning. And we started to drive their soldiers from our streets to make shit. You'd think they'd take a hit and back down after we take our one around. But no. It just made them more committed to their occupation.
Of course we were more committed. I mean, they threw a beer at one of our boys. And it was a Miller High Life. That's not a throwing beer, that's a drinking beer. You know, a couple of guys had their doubts. You know, they'd say things like, maybe we shouldn't be here anymore. Or maybe the students don't want us here. But, I think on the whole, ultimately we're just all on edge. October 10th, well, that was the day that was really tough for us. That was like our normal day. We couldn't tell which students supported us, which students were insurgents, and I had no idea students were capable of using force like that against us. Breaks my heart. You know, that's what drove us to do so many vehicle patrols. It was the only way to keep us safe on duty, and yet we had no idea it was going to make things so much worse.
As tensions rose at Hamilton throughout late 2020, it became increasingly clear to outside observers that the situation would not resolve as quickly as originally hoped. Dr. F. Moose, a professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School and an expert in occupations, monitored the situation in Hamilton as it unfolded in 2020 and into 2021.
That was when we truly started to understand the magnitude of the anti-campus safety sentiment. It was also when researchers began sounding the alarm bells. The main concern that we had was that the peacekeepers were going to experience an identification problem and end up taking very harmful actions to the mission. We've seen similar problems in earlier occupations, such as in Iraq in 2003. It was definitely something a lot of us in the field were keeping an eye on. October 10th really was a watershed moment, though. That was when we all knew that the situation was becoming a crisis. At that point, we all kind of just held our breath to see what the CTF was going to do to respond.
Following the October 10th incident, Campus Safety released a letter to students urging witnesses to come forward with tips about the perpetrators. To date, no students are known to have come forward regarding October 10th. In response to the lack of student cooperation and calls of peacekeeping troops on the ground, Campus Safety eliminated all foot patrols in favor of armored patrols and Ford Explorers, a move that angered many students.
The move to mechanize following October 12th was exactly the type of response that we were afraid of, and for good reason. Just like we saw in Iraq, the aftermath of the mechanization of the CTF forces, we saw a noticeable drop-off in the ability of the peacekeepers to communicate with the students. This made it harder to identify threats, enforce COVID protocols. Even more alarming was that through the spike of this insurgency amongst students, there was a heightened number of weekly skirmishes between the peacekeepers and the insurgents.
I mean, what were we supposed to think? They tell us they're here to help us and to protect us, but then they go and roll Ford Explorers down the streets. They say we're their friends, but they treat us like we're the enemy. I just remember being so angry and afraid. How could we be the enemy on our own campus?
While hostilities between Campus Safety and student body insurgents reached new highs, another crisis began to emerge at Hamilton. Students began testing positive for COVID-19, a novel coronavirus that had destroyed many other campuses. Anthony Mitchell was one of the first students at Hamilton to be moved into quarantine.
I remember I was just sitting in the library and a campo officer approached me and asked me if my name was Anthony Mitchell. And I was pretty scared, and they told me that I was being taken into quarantine because I had tested positive. And it was really difficult to see some of my friends test positive and get put into quarantine.
I was asleep when the phone rang. They told me I was being contact traced, and then within 12 hours, they had me thrown in the back of a van on my way to some random hotel in the middle of New Hartford. I spent a week in the hotel when I got the call that I was positive for COVID. That changed me, that rattled me. I spent so long fighting the occupation and really trying to stop these protocols that were being enforced upon us, and once I got that positive test, I realized maybe we should have been following the protocols. Maybe Campo was right.
I barely remember the COVID cases starting. It was like one day there were none, and then all of a sudden half the campus was in the Homewood Suites or sick. The insurgents went around saying that this was Campo tyranny and that this was the police state they warned us about. But I noticed as my friends were getting quarantined, I never got sick. The protocols were working. That's when I started to distance myself from the insurgents. Maybe the occupation was necessary.
With COVID cases soaring and insurgency support faltering, the leadership of the COVID task force began making attempts to ease tensions with the student body. In April of 2021, Campus Safety Supreme Leader Mary Tartinez sent a campus-wide email announcing the beginning of a plan to demechanize peacekeeping forces at Hamilton. It showed the image of an officer wearing a new uniform, one without body armor or tactical gear.
The April email from Mary Tartinez was a very significant development in the course of the CTF occupation. It signaled that the CTF was willing to listen to the grievances of the student body and changes its tactics in response to them. Generally, this sort of behavior is effective in increasing the information for the occupying force.
You know, it was definitely scary having to switch back to the foot patrols, especially without the beer can protective vests and body armor. But you know, it's just one of those things where you kind of gotta trust the guys that are making the calls up top. But the crazy thing is, it worked. I don't think I saw any insurgent activity that first week of patrols back after the memo from General Tartinez.
Things were pretty quiet that first week after demechanization started. It seemed like things were heading in the right direction. COVID cases were declining, Campo was demilitarizing. At one point, we made it a full week without any new cases, and everyone was just ecstatic, you know? We were really grateful for the peacekeepers because it seemed like they were really helping. Then we went a second week with no new cases, and then a third, and then a whole month. But the patrols never went away. There were just as many Campo officers here a month after no cases as there were at the height of the outbreak. It seemed wrong. Why were they still here?
Something was off. I don't know. Something just didn't feel right. I mean, it had been an entire month since we had any COVID cases, and Campo was still everywhere. CTF told us that if we behaved, if we got rid of the COVID cases on campus, that we'd get our campus back, and the student body would be able to take control. But Campo was still here, the CTF was still here. I wasn't really sure what they were doing. That's when I went back to the insurgents.
We are something more powerful. Our struggle is for justice, for freedom. These are not things that can be killed with a stroke of Mary Tartinez's pen, but they are things that can be won with the throwing of a beer can. It's simple. Every day that Campo and their soldiers get up and put on their uniforms, we will do the same.
While timely notifications remain low at Hamilton, campus safety peacekeepers continue to clash regularly with insurgent cells throughout campus. With neither side willing to back down, and the crisis continuing to worsen, there is no spring break in sight.